Arhat refers generally to those in the state of post-learner among the three vehicles. In this state, the seeds of defiled mind, manas, and mind itself in its actual form are eternally exterminated, and therefore, Vasubandhu says, our pores nor exist. In the state of learner it is temporarily subdued during the samadhi of cessation and on the supramundane path, and therefore, Vasubandhu says, it does not exist. Since beginningless time, defiled manas has evolved subtly, freely, and uniformly and cannot be subdued by the impure paths. The holy paths of the three vehicles subdue it, because the understanding of true no-self, occurring on the paths, contradicts attachment to a self. When pure subsequently acquired knowledge, prasthilabdhanasravajena, is actually present, as the pure outflow of knowledge of no-self, it also contradicts manas. Because both the knowledge of true no-self and its subsequently acquired knowledge are both pure, they are called the supramundane path.
The samadhi of cessation is the outflow of the holy paths and is complete calm, so this, manas, does not exist. However, since the seeds of manas have not yet been eternally exterminated, when one arises from the samadhi of cessation and the holy paths, manas becomes active again as long as the seeds have not been destroyed. Passions associated with this defiled mind are innate and therefore are not exterminated on the path of insight, but since they are impure, they are not to be exterminated. The seeds of the passions are extremely subtle and are suddenly and simultaneously exterminated, along with the lowest of the three grades of passions, at the peak of existence, because they are the same in their power. During the diamond-like samadhi, Vajropamasamdathi, one suddenly exterminates these seeds and becomes an arhat. Therefore they never again appear in the post-learner, i.e., arhat. If the post-learners of the two vehicles convert to the Mahayana, then from the first arousal of the thought of enlightenment, up to the point where they become Buddhas, even though they are bodhisattvas, they are called arhats in the 30 verses. Even though they are not singled out especially, they fit the definition of an arhat.
13. Nondefiled Manas. There is an interpretation, by Sthiramati, that manas is only associated with the obstacle of the passions, because all holy teachings say that it does not exist in three states, that it is always associated with four passions, and that it is the support of the various defilements of consciousness. Another interpretation claims that that explanation contradicts both teachings and reason, because a scripture says that a supramundane manas exists, and because an undefiled mental consciousness, just as when it is defiled, definitely must have a support that is born with it and is special. A treatise says that store consciousness definitely always functions together with a consciousness, which is manas. When mental consciousness occurs, store consciousness appears with two consciousnesses, mental consciousness and manas. It functions with three when one of the first five consciousnesses appears, and, finally, sometimes it occurs with all seven, when all five consciousnesses operate together. If the seventh consciousness is absent in the samadhi of cessation, then at that moment, the store consciousness will not be accompanied by another consciousness and therefore is not always definitely evolving in association with one consciousness. Lacking the seventh consciousness, at the time of the holy paths, the store consciousness must be associated with one consciousness, and, in that case, how can the Yogacaarabhimi Sastra say that when mental consciousness appears, store consciousness definitely appears with two consciousnesses? The Aryadesanavikhyapana Sastra says that manas is always associated with four passions, or functions in association with their contraries, in either superiority or inequality, and therefore we know that manas can be either defiled or non-defiled.
If one concludes that arhats have no seventh consciousnesses, because, according to the Yogacaarabhimi Sastra, they are devoid of a defiled manas, one must also conclude that they also must have no eighth consciousness, because treatises also say that they have no galaya. However, since the latter cannot be so, is not the former also not so? Also, various treatises say that knowledge of sameness occurs upon the transmutation of the seventh consciousness, and, like any knowledge, must have as a support a pure consciousness with which it is associated. If this consciousness is missing in arhats, that form of knowledge must also not exist in them, because in the absence of a support, there is nothing to be supported. It may not be claimed that knowledge is supported by the six evolving consciousnesses, such as visual consciousness, because it is conceded that this knowledge is constant in Buddhas, just as mirror knowledge is, while the six consciousnesses constantly change.
Also, if post-learners have no seventh consciousness, the eighth consciousness must lack a simultaneous support, but it must have this support, because it is by nature like other forms of consciousness. Also, just as attachment to a self always occurs in one who has not yet realized the non-existence of a personal self, so also attachment to the selfhood of dharmas always occurs in one who has not yet realized the unreality of dharmas. If manas is absent, by what consciousness is this attachment supported? Not the eighth consciousness, because it lacks discernment. Consequently, we must trust that this seventh consciousness always occurs in the holy paths of the two vehicles, in the samadhi of cessation, and among post-learners, because these people have not yet realized the selflessness of dharmas.
Also, it is proven in various treatises that the seventh consciousness is the support of the sixth, because the first five consciousnesses are likewise supported by the sixth. If, when the holy paths arise, and when one is a post-learner, the seventh consciousness does not support the sixth, both the main point and the reasoning of the treatises are in error. Alternatively, the five material consciousnesses must lack a support, but they are always supported, and so must the sixth be supported. Therefore it is clear that in the three states mentioned above, post-learner, etc., there must always be a non-defiled manas. When it is said in some texts that it does not exist, they speak of defiled manas that does not exist, not the undefiled manas, just as, when they say that in four states there is no aleya, they do not mean that there is no eighth consciousness. The same is the case here.
14. Three kinds of manas there are, in short, three different kinds of manas. The first is manas, associated with a view of a personal self. The second kind is associated with a view of the selfhood of dharmas. The third kind is that associated with the knowledge of sameness. The first is common to continuities of all ordinary beings, learners of the two vehicles, and one kind of bodhisattva of impure mind prior to the seventh, bodhisattva, stage. This, manas, takes as object glava consciousness and generates a view of a personal self. The second is common to the continuities of all ordinary beings, disciples, sravaka, and pratyabuddhas, and bodhisattvas in the state when the fruit of the knowledge of the emptiness of dharmas is not present. This, manas, takes consciousness as retribution for an object and generates the view of the selfhood of dharmas.
The third is common to the continuities of all Tathagatas and to bodhisattvas in the path of insight, and to those for whom the fruit of the knowledge of the emptiness of dharmas is present in the path of cultivation. The manas takes as an object non-defiled consciousness as retribution, etc., and generates the knowledge of sameness. In the state when the view of a personal self occurs, the view of the selfhood of dharmas must also be present, because attachment to a self occurs supported by attachment to dharmas, just as the notion that there is a person, etc., occurs when we misapprehend a post, etc., in the dark. Even though the functioning of the two views of selves and dharmas is different, they are not contradictory, and both have the same discernment as a support, in the same way that even though the various consciousnesses such as visual are alike in substance, their many functions of distinguishing blue, etc., are not contradictory. It is the same here, with the two views. Even though attachment to dharmas remains only among learners of the two vehicles on the holy paths and in the samadhi of cessation, among bodhisattvas who awake suddenly on the path of cultivation, and among learners who